Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Phrames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Darren King, also known as ExoAcademian. You're listening to episode 66, Route 66. We're here to have some fun today and talk about a lot of interesting things that have been happening since we last talked just 3 weeks ago. Darren, you and I have remarked how much is going on and how it's hard to even keep track of it all. Just every single day there's some sort of interesting news cycle happening, both politically and in ufology, in other areas that intersect with ufology. So it's quite an interesting time to be plugged into this topic, and it's fun to talk about, really. I look forward to these conversations because there's just so much to get into and to unpack that has been happening in the day-to-day cycle. But before we get into all that, of course, I want to check in with you, see how things are going in your neck of the woods. For folks who aren't as familiar, Darren does, in fact, live in the woods in a nice, cute little cabin. And so when I'm asking him that, it is, in fact, the truth. What is happening in your neck of the woods? How are things?
Things are very good, and I absolutely enjoy living in my little neck of the woods here. I have lived in 7 different states, 3 different countries, 2 continents, and I wouldn't choose anywhere else to live. So the Blue Ridge Mountains are amazing and spectacular and mystical and all that, so I never take it for granted. But yeah, a lot of things going on for me personally. 2025 kicked off with a lot of fervor. I'm looking forward to things that are coming up this year. I'm going to be speaking at the Archives of the Impossible conference, which is the UFO and the Impossible, following Jeff Kripal's kind of history of talking about impossible things. That's going to be April 3rd to the 5th. So looking forward to that, not only speaking there, but just all the people I'm going to run into, many people that we know online and whatnot, virtually, that I'll get to see in person, which is always exciting. And then in the month after that, in May, I'll be speaking in Colorado at MUFON, Colorado, giving a talk called Contact as a Mechanism for Worldview Transformation. So I'm looking forward to that as well. And then in June, got this retreat coming up at Mount Shasta, which I know you will be taking part as well, which is exciting as well.
Yeah, not much going on. Sounds pretty light. No, that's fantastic. I'm glad to hear that you've got a full dance card. That's really good. And a lot of people who haven't heard your content or familiar with your content are going to get a chance to get your perspective during some of those experiences, and I'm grateful that they will. In my sort of neck of the woods, things are quite busy. The beginning of the year for me is always the busiest time in my professional life. So a lot going on. The energy is a little bit hectic, but it's nothing I haven't dealt with before, so it's sort of a little bit of a routine. Otherwise, things are going well. I'm enjoying the shift that has happened in the UFO conversation recently, the shift into the woo. If there's a gear on the gear shaft, it's the woo gear. That's the gear we're shifting into. And I'm very, very grateful for that. It's a fun gear to be in. The conversations are complicated. They, I think, require a lot of nuance and thoughtfulness, and you have to suspend your judgment, which is really difficult to do in the social media space, in particular, where judgment is kind of a currency, where we want to have a quick opinion and want to take a firm stance that generally gets the eyeballs right away. And I think with this kind of material, you've got to sort of let it hang out a little bit. You got to let it marinate, sort of let it steep, and see what comes out of that conversation, because I think there's a lot to be gleaned from experiences that sort of fall into the woo side of the pool, which is another fun image in my mind now. But at any rate, I digress. It is very fun to be in conversation right now. And Darren, we have a lot of territory to cover. And so where would you like to start? Do you want to talk with some recent sort of news, or where do you want to jump in?
I think since we last recorded an episode, which to the point you made earlier, so much happens in 3 weeks' time. But since then, we've had the preview of this movie, Age of Disclosure, that came out. We've also had a long-form interview with Jake Barber that we're going to get into and break down, because there's a lot of really important information there. But before we get into that stuff, I got a chance on Event Horizon to riff a little bit about Age of Disclosure and the impact I think that movie will have. But I'd love to give you an opportunity to reflect on what you think that's going to mean in this cultural moment.
Well, the hype is real. I think it's a very well, it appears to be a very well produced film. But what will strike you, I think, the most is the kind of voices that are in this film, that are in this conversation. Voices that some we've heard before, but some we certainly haven't heard before in a very public way. We've got Marco Rubio, we've got James Clapper, Mr. Feddersen, I can't remember his first name, who is a part of the National Aviation Safety, National Security Council. So some pretty big profile names here. Clapper, of course, being the first director of national intelligence. I mean, that's harder to think of a bigger name than that when it comes to the secrets of the U.S. intelligence community. So we've got some huge names here that are coming forward and putting their voices behind the disclosure movement. And I think it's going to be big. I don't see how you can just casually write off these appearances. You're not going to get Marco Rubio's time in a UFO documentary unless he's totally okay with that. You're not going to get Kristen Gillibrand's time in a UFO documentary unless she's totally okay with that. And so you just read between the lines here. This is something that they're taking very seriously. It is happening. That's the bottom line. And I think people in our community are prepared in some ways for that, are very eager for that. But I don't know if folks outside the community are really ready for the kind of broadside that they're going to receive from a film like this, because the sound bites are going to be pretty, I think, arresting. Now, will the media cover that? That's going to be interesting. And we're in a very public debate right now about the role that mainstream media plays within the United States. And that role is actively being challenged, at least when it comes to access to the White House and other governmental agencies. There is now more daylight between the mainstream media and the political establishment, and more independent media sources are being brought into the conversation. There are going to be good and bad things as a result of that. But it certainly, to me, means we're going to get more likelihood of the conversation seeping out into the public conversation as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing you didn't mention that I'm sure caught your attention was the specific thing that Jay Stratton says in that preview. And that was groundbreaking, I think, because many of us have perceived Jay Stratton, as I said on Event Horizon, as someone who holds his cards pretty close to his chest. He's pretty reserved. And he's also seemed to be one of these people who wants to pursue the usual measures, the constitutional measures, use government and the structures that already exist to slowly roll this out. So to your point, this absolutely seems to be one of those measures, one of the tools they're using when people have talked about this potential rollout of disclosure from 2017 on, a posture that kind of shifted then, that has taken us to where we are now. This seems like, to some degree, the capstone on that movement in many ways. And for someone like Jay Stratton to say that he's not only with his own eyes seen non-human craft, but he's also seen non-human beings, that was a game changer in my perspective, because again, it's one thing if you're seeing a light in the sky and you can interpret that differently depending on your perspective. But seeing a non-human being right in front of you, it's pretty hard to have misidentification at that point. So the fact that he's coming out and saying that, and saying that he's not just heard about it secondhand from a whistleblower, but he has seen it with his own eyes, is very consequential. And of course, you and I both know that a while back there was a bit of controversy between people like Lou Elizondo and Jay Stratton. But in Jay Stratton posting on social media right after this preview came out, he actually was very much mending bridges, United Front kind of thing, said, I'm looking forward to coming forward along with other disclosure advocates like Lou Elizondo. So very much we're on the same page, same team. It's time for this to happen, which makes me, again, think about the very opening to that preview, where one government representative was basically saying the people are ready to know the truth. And of course, the implication there is this is not a question of what the truth is. This is not a film that's meant to ask questions. This is a film meant to be pretty hard-hitting with statements from people that the public is going to view as the most credible to know these things, saying this is the deal, now it's time to start dealing with it. So to me, this seems like, for the long scope of history, a monumental moment. When you think about people who've been in this for decades, and you think about Project Blue Book, all these attempts to basically squash this and to ridicule those who take it seriously, Here we very deliberately have people in and around Washington, D.C., right? So we see the monuments and whatnot of Washington, which in itself sets a certain tone of like officialdom to this. These people coming forward in that context to say, this is real, the people are ready, it's not a question. The issue is, what are we going to do about it? To me, that was striking and definitely marks a new moment for our culture.
Yeah, undoubtedly. I'm very excited about it. It's going to open up a whole bunch of cans. So very interesting. And March 9th, I believe, is I think that's the premiere at South by Southwest. So we should start hearing a lot more about the film after that premiere. So truly, truly excited for it. And kudos to all the work that went into getting that across the finish line. I know it's been in the works for quite some time. And then, of course, Darren, we've also got news just yesterday, I believe, about the final name of the Spielberg production that is kicking off in actually this month, starting filming later this month. And that Spielberg film is going to be called Disclosure. Yeah, if you had that Disclosure, that's where we're hearing a lot of lately. So quite interesting, very direct. Certainly isn't going to be called The Dish, which I think is what it was rumored to be called before that. And so very, very curious. I think it will be coming out sometime in 2026 if it adheres to schedule. So that'll be interesting if it comes on the heels of a hard-hitting documentary this year. And of course, whatever other developments occur in the conversation from the U.S. government this year, which there seems to be a greater likelihood that we're going to get more efforts towards transparency from the U.S. government. Although I will say that, talk is cheap. So we're going to see what really happens from the administration. They seem to be, very publicly willing to do it. But what will occur, I think it'll be interesting what we actually get to hear from our elected officials.
Absolutely. And you made me think about something when you mentioned Spielberg, because when we think back to the monumental moment when Close Encounters of the Third Kind was released, and what many people have remarked about since then is that there are many aspects of the lore that made their way into that film. And many people feel like it was a kind of disclosure of its own right. Of course, not only do we have a character in the film that's meant to basically be an equivalent of Jacques Vallée, but we have numerous elements of the contact phenomena that seem to align with people's experience. And even in retrospect, sometimes where Spielberg seemed to know things before it was even public understanding. So that makes you wonder about to what degree has there been kind of a leaking from official sources to filmmakers like Spielberg to slowly let the public know about this. And the way to do it safely is to first engage with our imagination. But as Diana Pasulka, who we're going to discuss later, has mentioned, for the human mind, when you have things you've come across in film or books you've read and things that have actually happened to you or people that you know, there's a certain degree to which that just becomes part of what you entertain. So it kind of gets past the fight or flight kind of aspect because you're already engaging with it. And because of that, if you're going to eventually confirm something to the American people, a good way to roll it out psychologically and socially is to do it through film and fiction first. Of course, we think about Tom DeLonge and these books that were published as fiction, but the strong notion being that just allowed plausible deniability, and actually a lot of important information is actually in those. So it's going to be interesting. Spielberg kind of is this icon in film and our history, in our society. So the fact that he has a new film coming out in the kind of climate we're in now, which is so pro-disclosure, will be very interesting to see how far they take things with that film. I haven't heard much about it. Have you? And I'm curious to see what this film is actually going to be about.
Yeah, I don't know very much at all, other than I think they have released the sort of the actors that will be in the film, and I can't remember all of their names. So it will certainly be interesting, and will be kind of a capstone, a bookend in a way to Close Encounters, and all of the work, of course, that Spielberg has done over the years of bringing imagination to life. Right, I think the role, as you highlighted there, the role that the imagination plays in reality is critical, as we've talked about many times here. And so it doesn't surprise me, quite frankly, that a master of bringing imagination into reality, so to speak, is a part of this grand movement of disclosure, the disclosure of the true nature of reality. It doesn't surprise me at all that an artist would be a key figure in that conversation and helping to kind of give birth to that reality into our world. So Very, very excited for that and for the conversations that will inevitably follow.
Absolutely. All right, so something else that's been happening, moving away from films now, of course, part of what we've been seeing, and you referenced this a few minutes ago, Nathan, you've seen this transition happening politically in our country. And because of that, we have certain figures that were pretty outspoken for politicians about this matter disclosure and UAP, who now hold pretty substantial offices. One of those, of course, is Marco Rubio, who's now Secretary of State. And Chris Sharp recently published something on social media that he sees as being pretty consequential. He said, quote, Rubio in charge of the National Archives is potentially enormous in consequences. The archives oversee the National Declassification Center. The archives are now also responsible for building the UAP data collection. Then he quotes here, you might recall last year, the archives extended until September 2025, the deadline for agencies and departments to turn over UAP records. The archives will, and likely does, have a lot of UAP data already. The archives also have important collections like the JFK assassination records collection and others, unquote. So what we're basically seeing here is that where the UAP Disclosure Act was trying to slowly change legislation to allow for more transparency, now we're seeing people in direct leadership of certain roles that give them access directly to some of these archives, some of these secrets. And many people within our circles are hoping that means we're going to see a lot more transparency. We're going to see things begin to leak out. And like you hinted at the last Liminal Phrames episode, we might see people just turn things over wholesale. And who knows what will come. But what's your expectation and your hope in terms of what that will see in terms of fruition?
Well, this is unprecedented. I don't think this has ever occurred in U.S. political history where a member of the cabinet is also serving in an acting director capacity for the U.S. National Archives. That's really quite strange, particularly when we're talking about the Secretary of State. So one of the most prominent members of the president's cabinet is going to be taking this role. So it is certainly interesting, and obviously there's a clear intersection between Rubio and his interest in UAP, his public statements on UAP, the testimony that he has heard and his staff has heard from various whistleblowers of UAP programs. I get the sense that he certainly knows more than he's been able to say publicly, but I also get the sense that he himself wants to have that information. He wants to get his hands on that information, and perhaps that efforts to do so have been stymied by the political apparatus of the U.S. Bureaucracy up until this point. And so the optimist in me is certainly very much looking forward to what may come from this partnership. If I were to take a devil's advocate, a negative perspective on it, it is a little bit concerning, this consolidation of power over, with the cabinet and the U.S. Archives, and the message control that could come from that in terms of what is it that the public is going to know and not know, and how closely is Trump and the Trump administration able to dictate the conversation. That certainly is a concern as well, and I think we should be fair in stating it as such. So we shall see. A tremendous amount of potential is there, and there are many lawmakers from across the aisle who are interested in bringing this out to the American public, and that certainly was highlighted in that trailer we just discussed. You had Democrats and Republicans in that trailer, and I think it's one of the few issues, in fact, that our representatives seem to be able to agree on, which gives me a great deal of hope that this isn't just about scoring political points, but it truly is about getting to the truth and transparency with the American people and the world.
Indeed. And one of the things that you and I have discussed privately is kind of the strange difference in terms of how the left and the right politically tend to engage with this topic. That many people on the left lump all sorts of conspiracy theories together, and ufology has tended to fall within that. And so they've historically been pretty reticent to want to engage with this topic. Whereas people on the right, who tend to already think there's all sorts of conspiracies going on, tend to think the UFO topic is just one more of them. And so it is going to be interesting now that the right is going to have pretty expansive power in government, how they're going to use that and what revelations might emerge that perhaps makes the left finally engage, perhaps wakes the left up that there's more going on than they've assumed, and that as Richard Dolan has pointed out, this term conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorist is kind of this slur that's used to distract people basically from paying attention to important matters. So it'll be very interesting to see where things go from here. Like you say, you cannot separate this from the concerning aspects of what's rolling out in our country right now and even the implications for the world. But this is where we are. Crazy times indeed. And of course, speaking of how different conspiracy theories get wrapped up all together, and you mentioned the woo earlier on, of course, what many people coming from the left, coming from a more secular perspective, are confronted by when it comes to this kind of data and this kind of information and this kind of topic is that woo is central and that there's some pretty strange matters that are wrapped up in all of this, high strangeness, as we often say. And it's interesting to look back at, for instance, the history of someone like Jacques Vallée and see how he evolved over time based on what he saw in the data. So we're going to have people in power who are more willing, I think, to put forward the strange elements of this phenomenon, and how might that move us forward or not? We shall see. But speaking of Vallée and recent events, he's also just recently published Forbidden Science 6. These are his journals that he's been publishing 1 decade at a time. This is the journals of Jacques Vallée from 2010 to 2019. It's titled Scattered Castles. I really enjoy these books because not only do they offer all sorts of interesting tidbits about ufology and inner circles that were looking into these things, working groups and whatnot, but also we see Jacques' reflections on different cultural moments we've all been through. So I find it very interesting to read his accounts and remember myself where I was when certain things happened. And of course, right now I'm only up to around 2013. I'm very curious to see how he responds when we get to 2017 and all the ramifications that came from Leslie and Ralph's article and things like that. But I wanted to highlight this one quote from this book because it speaks to the high strangeness. It speaks to the absurdity that's wrapped up in this phenomenon. And this is something that he is willing to look at because, to his credit, and this is something I really appreciate about Vallée, he doesn't hide from the data. If it's in the data, he demands that we try to make sense of it. So this is a quote from Forbidden Science 6. He says, quote, "New cases of large dogs," in quotes, at the Utah ranch, standing on their hind legs. Also coyotes, again, in quotes, running upright next to the car, and other peculiar animals. The Ute shaman doesn't find it unusual, unquote. So that says so much in a couple sentences there. But you and I, of course, have engaged on the matter of Skinwalker Ranch and the things that have happened there. And many people, again, coming from nuts and bolts circles, don't want to get anywhere close to this stuff because it looks like silly paranormal stuff to them. And yet somehow this is all wrapped up together. And I remember one time coming across this one colleague that said they were interested in hearing from one person until they realized that person also spoke about Sasquatch. And so for them, that was a completely separate matter than ufology, and they couldn't take them seriously. And I had to sit this person down and explain, actually, this matter is all wrapped up together. And you get UFOs and portals and Sasquatch and dino beavers and everything, all the above at Skinwalker Ranch. And it's always fascinating when you think about someone like Vallée, such a historic person in terms of his analysis of our history. And he was right at the beginning of the internet and collating databases. And he didn't shy away from this. And still today, his databases are among some of the most important to ever come forward. And when Jacques does pass on, it's going to be to everyone's benefit that his archives are going to end up at Archives of the Impossible as well, along with John's and Whitley Strieber's, for instance. But have you read that book, and what have you heard about it? And what do you make of this moment we're in where the woo just will not go away, and even the nuts and bolts seemingly are going to have to deal with it?
Yes, well, Sasquatch is welcome in my house anytime. I haven't read this book. I did pick up volume 5, and I agree with you. It's an invaluable resource. We are incredibly fortunate to have someone like Jacques Vallée with his background experience spanning a tremendous number of years of this phenomena and active investigation of it, and watching so many different cases, and also the transformation of the conversation in the public. This is a person who we owe a great deal of gratitude and debt, and for keeping a journal out like this. It's truly invaluable. It's something that I wish I was more disciplined at doing, because I think it really provides you insights with into where you were at a certain time, how you were reflecting on certain events. I think it's very, very powerful, meaningful, and I know that there will be efforts to sort of collate this content, as you said, with the other content from John Mack and Whitley Strieber, and glean insights from all of this material. Of course, I'm also thinking of all the letters that were sent to Whitley Strieber in the wake of his book Communion. So taking all of that content, which is in the thousands and thousands of documents here, and then using the tools of AI to kind of tease out some interesting insights will be really, really valuable. We're just great. We're just really fortunate to have Jacques in the conversation, and I think the woo isn't going anywhere. I think I'm grateful that it's been thrust into the conversation in the way that it has. I don't think there's ever a way in our current sort of world where you can bring the woo in and bring it in where people are like, well, yeah, I'm ready for it now. It's always going to be a little bit like a splash of cold water on the face. And in some respects, that's very good because it gets us talking about, well, is this okay? Or am I ready to hear this? What do you think this means? I've had experiences, and it confronts us. It's something that we have to wrestle with both individually and collectively. And that's in part the purpose of it all, right? It's the purpose of the woo to, I think, break open our sense of what is possible and what is real, and ask us to question our assumptions and our foundations so that we can come to a closer understanding of what the nature of reality happens to be. So it's an integral part of this conversation, and I don't see it going away now. I think it certainly has entered the conversation over the years, but I don't see it retreating or receding at this point. I think it's going to be a part of the conversation at this point going forward.
Certainly seems that way, and especially because most of the disclosure is happening around data-driven kind of efforts, and this is wrapped up in the data. We think back to Bass and the attempts that they engaged in terms of trying to get empirical evidence to back this up. They saw that in the data, and to their credit, even though it was difficult to get the government to sign off on this, and that's partly why eventually it was canceled, they understood that UFOs, Sasquatch, Dino Beavers, portals, all of this is somehow wrapped up together. And I think it's much more interesting, actually, and fascinating and enchanting that that's the case. All right, now, speaking of these matters, of course, wrapped up in this is psi, and a new term that's kind of emerged recently, psionics, which has to do with consciousness being at the center here. And of course, this is something we've been championing and discussing on this podcast for a long time now. But we actually published our last episode just before the first interview with Jake Barber by Ross Coulthart. It came out later that day. So we both had a chance to see that since then. And of course, since then, Jesse Michaels also did a multi-hour interview with Jake Barber. We're going to get into this bit by bit, segment by segment, because there were so many revelations that were really consequential that emerged from those interviews, especially the second one. But before we jump into a bit by bit kind of analysis, I just want to get your initial take on how you were impacted by that particular interview and how you think it will help move the conversation forward.
Well, I wasn't expecting the degree to which Barber's experience was so personal. I certainly wasn't expecting that. I think when you hear about program insider whistleblower coming forward, military background, you're thinking, oh, this is going to be some very hard-hitting factual information that's very nuts and bolts oriented, operations, that kind of stuff. And you get some of that with Barber, certainly. But the fact that his interview with Ross veered right into this almost mystical experience, highly emotional experience that he had in retrieving one of these craft, that was something that I was not at all prepared for. The longer form interview with Jesse Michaels is excellent. So if you haven't watched or listened to that, you absolutely should, because it gets into all of these things in great detail. And what I think I come away with in listening to Barber recount his experiences is just how intelligent this man is, how confident he is, what his intentions are. They all seem to be very focused on moving the needle and moving this conversation forward. We will see. Time will tell, right? He certainly has made that statement that, how can we take this guy seriously? I mean, can we trust him? He said, you'll know me by my fruits, you'll know me by the things that we're able to produce. And I think we're going to have to give this person some time to produce the evidence that we would like. but the combination of elements that go with Jake's story, as well as the other individuals who've come forward to back his claims, their stories as well are also very, very interesting and compelling. So you have not just one person, but several who are stepping forward to lend further credibility to the validity of a secretive program in crash retrieval, and not just retrieving objects, but how we might be interacting with those objects. So truly a fascinating stuff. And as you said, psi is a big part of that, and it's now, I think, much more part of the public conversation.
Absolutely. And to the point you made there at the beginning, one of the really interesting revelations is not just what has happened, but what Skywatchers, which is the organization that he's involved with, are attempting to do. And they're attempting to do it this year. So as much as we talk about disclosure being this kind of government-led effort, and this creates its own kind of funny moment, because you get some of the same people who say, don't trust the government, man. They always lie to you. It's always a psyop. It's also some of those same people saying, we need the government to come clean on this so we can finally embrace it and deal with it as a society, which is kind of contradictory in some ways, at least paradoxical. But what we have people like Barber coming forward to say is that there are private institutions that are actually well-funded, for instance, that are attempting to get some of that same data, and not just data that kind of hints at something, that might even prove something. So, of course, using psionics, using these psychic capacities, they're talking about basically calling craft, bringing craft in, being able to get tangible evidence as a result, and that might be what delivers disclosure to society. And it wouldn't even need to use government, although he did point out that they are in cooperation with certain agencies on the inside that perhaps are also interested in this happening in this way. And I just want to point out to people that I think that, again, points to where we are right now. There's actually cooperation between the private and the public sector to get this out, which isn't to say there aren't some branches, some elements, some factions within government and within NHI, for that matter, that don't want this out. There are many that do. And again, something that we've touched on before is the timeliness of this. Why now? What's coming that people know about? This is the 2027 thing that's come up. But nevertheless, not only are we hearing conversations about future dates, but we're seeing actions that you could postulate are related to preparing us for those potential moments at a future date. But let's jump into Jake's history and how he got involved here. So he was recruited into the Air Force in the Clinton era, and he was part of a guaranteed training special operations track. So basically what we learn here, and I have come across other accounts like this, where someone basically is given a day job, and on paper it looks like they're doing one thing, but on the other side of things, they're actually involved in top secret things, often involving UAP. But there'll be no paper record of that, or very little anyway, because that way it provides plausible deniability again. So he was trained as a helicopter pilot, but he makes clear in his interview with Ross Coulthart that basically was just a cover. Gave him something he could say he was doing, but he was actually involved in some of these other things, which has to do with crash retrievals, which of course has been one of the matters everyone's been trying to get to the bottom of. So over about 2 decades, Jake says he and his teams were employed to retrieve various downed objects, often in the southwestern U.S. desert, which is interesting in itself, because we know about the events that are going on there, the actions going on, operations going on with the military. Why is that all wrapped up together? Sometimes these retrievals turned out to be normal military craft, but he says 2 of these personally recovered were clearly non-human in origin. We're going to get into each of those, but give me your first take on the plausibility when you listen to someone like Jake Barber talk about how he was recruited and what the cover was and supposedly what was happening in terms of crash retrievals while he was carrying on those surface activities.
Yes, well, again, I think he comes across as a highly intelligent person with a great deal of skills. I think it's very plausible that his background is, in fact, as he says that it is. And I say that because he also has other individuals who have come forward to bolster his claim. So they either all have to be in collusion with one another, or he is in fact who he says he is. And that's the kind of person that I think you would expect to find in a program like this. And so I remember sort of saying something on social media that, when there was reaction initially about some of his claims, and there was a lot of people talking about, here's these these veterans with this PTSD, and they're kind of making up all these stories, and they're just seem a little bit crazy. And my comment on this was, what if what they're saying sounds a little bit crazy, that's to me a more indicator that they have had an experience, because here's something that is non-conventional. It's not conforming to the nature of reality that you understand it to be, and you're encountering this, either an object or a being or both. I mean, that's going to be, disturbing. It's going to change who you are, and it's going to make you say some things and think some things that aren't conventional. That are going to be a little bit, discombobulating. So that's what I expect to see for someone that's been close to a program like this. I'm also struck by kind of the line that he's treading here. I think this hasn't been talked about very much in conversations that I've heard on another podcast, just talking about this interview. But here's someone who did submit material to Dobser, who had a very complicated strategy in terms of how they would go about kind of getting information to be sort of whitelisted, to be discussed publicly, and then what the Dobser process was going to blacklist, that kind of thing. There's a great deal that he's not saying, right? So you have to kind of take it in a totality, in my opinion. You're getting what he's able to say, and those are the sort of factual pieces, but you're also getting his attitude, right? His emotional attitude about the process, about his claims, about the direction that it's going. And that attitude, to me, isn't backed up by just fancy. It's backed up by actual knowledge. It's just that he can't tell you what the knowledge is. I think that obviously it's incredibly frustrating, and that does boil down in many cases to this "trust me, bro" thing that we hear about. And I get it. That's really frustrating. But I think a person like this, who's putting it out on the line, who's coming forward in the way that he has, who's got a family, who's got a professional career, who's got a public persona now that is going to be scrutinized. I mean, he's seen what happened to David Grush. He's seen what happened to other public whistleblowers like Mike Herrera, who we could also talk about. This is not something that you're going to do just because you think it's going to make you famous. Like, it's going to bring a lot of scrutiny on you and your family, and that to me adds more credibility to his claims. So I'm very much looking forward to what more may be coming out. But it's hard not to see the timing of this in terms of the scope of the conversation that has taken place since 2017, the trajectory that we're on. It does, in many ways, I hate to use this word, but it feels a little bit orchestrated. And I think in hindsight, we'll know the truth at some point, but it does, this is the direction that the conversation would go and how it would go if it were, in fact, a more orchestrated process. And I think there are components of this disclosure movement that are, in fact, planned out.
Absolutely. And you and I have discussed on previous episodes, actually, that that's the socially responsible thing to do. That if you're in government, then you have to think not just about the truth you need to disclose, but how you should do so to create the least amount of ripples in society. And this is an ontologically shocking matter. So you have to give a lot of forethought to how you want to roll it out. And you might likely roll it out in numerous ways in different quarters to different groups of people, so that there's not just one shock to the system. There's kind of shock absorption that happens, which we've used as a metaphor before. Yes, and I want to get into the Dobser process because that in itself is fascinating. And he's basically red teaming the government, basically, is what he talks about there. But before we get into that stuff, let's talk about the two craft that are mentioned. Now, the first one is this egg-like vehicle that was recovered. And this, of course, was being teased by Ross Coulthart before that episode aired. And many people were looking forward to this because Ross was saying this is the clearest video we've ever seen of a UAP. And so a lot of people had their expectations high. I remember very specifically that you and I were both pretty cautious about, guarding our expectations prior to that being revealed. And I've had people write to me and say, you and Nathan were bang on, because it certainly didn't convince a lot of people. Those who kind of already believe this thought it was interesting. Those who are not convinced weren't at all more convinced because of that. So let's talk about the egg and what happened. So first of all, one craft, which Jake calls the egg, was about 20 feet long and nearly seamless. So it was oval or egg-shaped with a pearly white sheen. He lifted it via his helicopter using a 150-foot external sling, and he estimated it weighed under 5,000 pounds because that was kind of the limit that he could lift. There was no visible damage to the ground or any clear sign of a conventional crash, which again raises issues around, are these things crashing? Are they landing? Are they donations, right? So he's saying when he arrived, there's no sign of a conventional crash in that kind of way. Now, this issue of why did he think it was non-human in origin? What were the non-human indicators? So Jake and his team were given minimal briefing on the object and had no standard protocol. Everyone seemed caught off guard by this, which he was noting was unusual because usually when you go in, this is pretty well organized. You've been through these kind of things before. You get the sense that people seem psychologically not on guard because this is very familiar. Everything was opposite of that this time around. Things were kind of stilted. Things were kind of on edge. He sensed that even the superiors around him were flustered by this. And that led him, in addition to some of the shape and whatnot, led him to believe it was non-human in origin. And of course, then we learned that later on, the UAP office confirmed to him, apparently, that it was non-human. We touched on that in our last episode. There's still a question of in what way did they confirm that and what evidence did they have to suggest that was the case. But give me your take on how the egg thing was rolled out, the video we saw, because you haven't had a chance to weigh in on that yet, and how convincing you thought it was and how much you think that particular incident itself moved the ball forward.
No. I have a lot of questions about the egg. I think it's a really fascinating piece of footage, but it does open up a host of questions about exactly what's going on there. The sort of reading between the lines, it was my impression, maybe this is not accurate, that footage wasn't the same egg that Barber was discussing. It was some other footage of another egg, which also, again, raises further questions about how many eggs there may be. What kind of craft are these? So that was certainly interesting. There's been a lot of discussion on the footage itself. People who have dissected that video and have tried to kind of tease apart little details. It's difficult. It's difficult to really come to a definitive conclusion by looking at that footage. It's certainly a very brightly lit object. It appears to be bright in the night vision footage that we've seen. It doesn't deform the ground. It does roll a little bit when it's dropped on the ground. So it's a truly fascinating object. But what I was struck by, because he's asked this question, as you pointed out, that, how do you know this was a non-human craft? Like, what makes you think that it was that and not just something else? And he said, well, it was a host of factors, some of which you pointed out, which is, the protocols they followed were different, the communications channels that they used were different. But he said, it wasn't just his perspective; it was the perspective of his entire team. Now, keep in mind, objects on the ground don't just put themselves in a sling for a helicopter to come and pick them up. There are people who are down there who are securing the site, who are affixing the sling to the object, and those people are part of the team. And if these people who are coming in direct contact with this object are informing his opinion on its origin, that gives me a lot more confidence that it is, in fact, a non-human craft. These are people with a lot of experience retrieving all kinds of material, and they would certainly know, oh yeah, this is part of a down satellite, or oh yeah, this is part of a parachute, or part of an aerostat, or some other test military vehicle. I mean, they would know that, and so I think it certainly gives it more credibility that it's non-human than it is human. Now, could it be some type of reverse engineered human craft? Well, I think that possibility is on the table. I think that certainly could be could be true, but we don't know enough now to say otherwise. But I do tend to take him at his word that this does seem to be a non-human object. Truly fascinating.
Yeah, and I'm surprised no one yet has started making T-shirts that say "Summon the Egg." I think that would be pretty popular. Although with the price of eggs right now, many people might think they should do that just to be able to land a dozen, that they can cook in the morning. All jokes aside, now, of course, speaking of summoning the egg, that is a major aspect of this. Not only did he have this experience with this one egg historically, but Jake and his small team, now in a private group called Skywatchers, claim to have repeatedly summoned the same egg-like craft in broad daylight. And apparently even he purported to do this for the latest director of Arrow as well. So this is fascinating. And again, this is what they're claiming they're going to attempt to do for the public with scientists on board, measuring this all and everything. At one point, we see Gary Nolan actually on scene trying to measure this, make sure it's being done with scientific rigor. But this is what they're kind of pointing to and how this might help bring disclosure. Now, of course, what's fascinating about this is you may remember when we did a podcast episode a year or so ago, we were talking about the revelations that came out from James Lukatsky. And he talked about actually being able to breach an actual object, a vehicle. Although he did say when he went inside and there was no signs of navigation or anything, he said it begs the question, what are we actually looking at, right? And maybe the implication being, could that be a time machine or something else? It was unclear what it was. But what's interesting is someone caught the fact that somewhere it was mentioned that that craft was actually an egg shape as well. And furthermore, it's come out since then that apparently these are a dime a dozen for defense contractors who've recovered many of these egg-shaped vehicles, which in itself is fascinating and prompts additional questions. So what's your take on that? The fact that they're going to try to use consciousness-based techniques, psionics, to bring these craft in, that they've apparently done it on repeated occasions, and that on top of that, defense contractors have these stored up somewhere. This is pretty compelling evidence and might, move this needle forward even for people that tend to be skeptical of these matters.
It's certainly a very well funded effort. That seems pretty obvious to me. There's a organized team. They seem to have a strategy. They've got already released an initial episode of their attempts at summoning the craft with psionic assets, with some new faces introduced in that episode as well, who are basically saying straightforward that they are psionic assets who have been part of one of these programs. And that's something that we've not really heard before in this fashion. I will say, this is a sidebar to that. Think about Dan Sherman, who came out many years ago and recounting his experience. Certainly some similar elements there of psionic ability related to the craft, related to abductions, all those kinds of things. A partnership, if you will, between a human being with these psi abilities and these non-human beings and their activities. So there's certainly a precedent for that conversation in ufology. At this point, people, I think rightly so, show me the money. They want to see the material. They want to see that these claims, these very bold claims, can be backed up with real evidence. And I think that's a very fair thing to request. And Skywatchers have really put it out all on the line. Like they say they're going to do it. It's not been very ambiguous. They're going to do it. That's pretty bold. So we shall see. I would hate, honestly, for this to devolve into kind of another Skinwalker Ranch type of situation where it becomes like a show or a serial and they're trying to do this and they're just never able to quite get it done. I think I'm hoping we're past that at this point, that we can really get some tangible evidence that scientists can evaluate. But at the same time, you and I both know this phenomena is more than just a nuts and bolts thing. It's more complicated than that. And so I get the need for this evidence that we all crave, but I hate to break it to folks. This is going to be more complicated than we'd like in terms of what that evidence, the forms and nature of what that evidence may be, is not necessarily going to conform to our standards. And that, I think, is going to be frustrating and will continue to be frustrating, but it's a part of what this truly is.
Very true. And for those not familiar with the Dan Sherman account, I would actually go back and research that. I actually did a POC episode on his account because the implications are fascinating, but also really consequential, because he talks about basically, in retrospect, he feels like there was some sort of arrangement that happened before he was ever born, that his mother, who was an abductee, was basically part of a program, and that his DNA was engineered in such a way, augmented in such a way, that he would grow up to have these capacities to allow for some communication with the Greys that could be in communication with this one very elite aspect of the Air Force to basically pass on information that he came to believe was about when abductions were going to happen and where, coordinates and things like that. Because, of course, I've had people reach out to me who ask the question that they think is sort of screaming at us across the screen, which is, what are the NHI doing while we supposedly summon these craft? Is it a case where Nathan's using psionics to take Darren's Toyota Corolla and drive it to Asheville without his awareness? Or is Darren allowing this? Is this something in cahoots going on here? This, of course, is a fascinating question, series of questions that arise. And it at least leads us to the possibility, in terms of conceptualizing here, that maybe this is one way that MHI is cooperating with us for disclosure to happen. And that because this is not just about, these are the facts, ma'am, here you go, but it's also about them having an interest in growing our capacities and helping us to step into our agency, that maybe they want to demonstrate that this comes through us using our psionic ability so that we also wake up into our greater potential. And this doesn't just end up being about nuts and bolts craft. So that in itself is fascinating. So we'll see what happens with these eggs. You and I know there's been cases before where people, I'm thinking of Anjali, and we had a conversation about this in the early days of Liminal Phrames, where she was going to lead an expedition to the mountain in California, where the beings underground were going to have a conversation with everybody, and that was going to be disclosure. Everybody knows it didn't work out the way that it was planned. So that begs the question, because there is a trickster element to this phenomenon, might that show up here? Might the Skywatchers guys, even if they are well-meaning, end up being duped by this? My sense is that this seems different. And again, this is part of the challenge here, because many people want to conflate and collapse this to being one thing, when I think we've got numerous kinds of non-human intelligence in our midst that are coming through different origin sources. And so one thing is not equal to the other. Is this egg from one kind of being that's maybe an ultra-terrestrial or not an extraterrestrial necessarily? Is that different than the beings that Anjali met, maybe in a different mode of consciousness? These are part of the questions we're entertaining. And the truth is, most people that are slowly entertaining this notion that ET are here are barely prepared to deal with the depth and the complexity of this matter. Okay, that's just the egg. Now we get to the real meat of the matter, because we get into this 8-gon craft or octagonal craft and what happened to Jake as a result in terms of a contact experience. So this was an octagonal kind of shaped craft, 25 to 30 feet, a disc basically, divided into 8 panels or segments. The retrieval briefing mentioned hazmat biologics as well, which is interesting, suggesting there were organic materials, but not necessarily living beings. Now, let's talk about the emotional/psychic effects. While sling loading this octagonal craft, Jake had an overwhelming emotional experience. He describes it as a powerful, sad, yet beautiful feminine energy that reminded him of his mother and his daughter, that nearly incapacitated him while flying. In fact, at one point he says he wonders if he was even going to be able to complete his mission. So he suggests either the craft itself was in some way conscious, the craft itself was conscious, or that a human psionic asset on the ground was linked to it and was unintentionally linking to him. So here we think about kind of entanglement or the hitchhiker effect, these things that get bandied about both in science these days as well within ufology. But I think for many people, myself included, I'm guessing for you, although I want to have you chime in for yourself, this was the most compelling part of the entire interview, both when he interviewed with Ross Coulthart and when he interviewed with Jesse, because you see him being very clearly moved. Not just then, but still today, he's moved by this experience. In fact, he goes so far as to say it basically orients his actions now, that he says it might sound strange, but that same presence that was so impacting then kind of feels like it's leading me now. So this completely goes into Wu land, of course. This completely obliterates the line between physical and spiritual and things like that. So give me your take on that part of the interview and how you were impacted by hearing how he was impacted.
Yeah, I found it to be incredibly authentic and brave for him to do that on national television. That's takes a lot of guts, honestly, to kind of be that vulnerable in front of the camera, not just once but twice on some, where a lot of eyeballs are going to be seeing that interview. And you're right, it was it's almost like he was reliving the moment. It was that real, and I found that to be very moving. I think it's always these things are always kind of a Rorschach test. You can see how people view this same content and come away with very different conclusions. Some view that and say, here's a mentally unstable person who, clearly they're just making all this stuff up. They don't seem to be able to hold themselves together. And you have others seeing that as a sign of authenticity and giving credibility to the experience. This is kind of this is the nature of the human family, how we look at these things. And I think it's okay to be in one of those two camps, or maybe even straddle them. I don't know, maybe I'm not sure about this, or I'm very sure about it. I'm not sure if it just, what day you ask me, I may have a different opinion. But I found that to be, like you said, one of the most powerful parts of the entire interview. And I think it's setting the table for the, future interesting aspects of this phenomena that need to be discussed. We can't just plant our feet firmly on the ground in nuts and bolts land indefinitely and expect to get any sort of new answers here. We're going to have to be brave enough to start exploring this other territory. And as well as I do, that this landscape includes a lot of destabilizing emotional woo-related components. And we're not even talking about abductions yet. And that, what way do we get to that, sort of destination on the map here? It's going to be very, very awkward for many people. And I think it's going to be hard for folks with with a conventional expectation of evidence to grapple with these sorts of stories because they don't conform to a nice, neat, formulaic narrative. They all have a little bit of that subjective quality to them, which is what you and I, of course, as we've discussed many times, that's what you would expect if the world and reality is in fact kind of a byproduct of our mental activity. Just like dreams are very individuated and very subjective, so too are, experiences that take place within quote unquote reality. And so that's what we should expect to see. And Les, I just want to say and echo what you pointed out, before you handed it over to me, because I've been wanting to mention this publicly and just haven't. But we tend to think that it's quite funny, honestly, how often we think that here's something that we are doing to capture these craft. Here we're causing these highly advanced craft to materialize from another dimension, and we're landing it with our minds and this is us. This is all us, baby. We just unlocked these special superpowers. And very few of us have stopped to question and think, maybe this is in fact a training. Maybe they are training us in order to understand who we really are, what the nature of reality truly is. That it's kind of it's a program, a coordinated program to help us become awaken to the reality of who we are and how things truly work. And so, they're very much still firmly in the driver's seat, and that way of looking at it, they're just trying to goad us along into kind of waking up from our stupor and realizing what we really can do and how reality may actually function.
Absolutely true. And that's certainly the perspective I take. And again, we see signs of this throughout history. And I would say the most inspiring ones are the ones that try to help us realize our potential. And that may indeed be happening here. And they may be sort of going through the motions of making us think that we're all doing this, but they're very much assisting us and helping us advance into this deeper capacity. All right, so let's jump back into, again, what Jake and his team do and what they say. So this is not an isolated occurrence. This is basically something the government has been using for some time now to activate and to engage with these objects. So Jake says certain military/intel units have recruited and trained psionic assets with remote viewing or telepathic abilities. These individuals can supposedly attract or quote-unquote summon UAPs via focused intention or meditation-like states. Machine-based methods also exist, like spatial radio or energy signals, to lure or excite UAPs. Again, it becomes very interesting how we interpret what their experience is. We've heard about the transportation of nuclear assets before and how that seems to trigger their response and their presence. Lou Elizondo talked about that in his book, that he actually proposed a certain action where they were going to do this and potentially lure these in, but I think it was poo-pooed eventually. And of course, we understand that this understanding about psi is central to intelligence activities for quite some time now. We think about what happened at SRI, the Stanford Research Institute, with the Stargate project, with people like Russell Targ, people like Hal Puthoff, who are right at the center of investigations into zero-point energy and propulsion for these craft, were also involved in the same kind of psi activities, psi investigations. And that the government was not only, as we knew before, using psi and remote viewing and whatnot to try to glean information about the Soviet Union, for instance, but apparently all along they've also been using psionic assets to basically interact with these craft. I just want to touch on something here because this is important. And this just shows again how sometimes our categories are sometimes, I would say, often insufficient. Because what Jake is talking about here is that the craft itself might seem alive, might be its own kind of consciousness. Now, we also hear some discussion of the small grays, for instance, often being perceived as androids or cyborgs kind of thing, as biological robots. Now, he described them as kind of like soft tissue drones, I think he said at some point. So this is fascinating, and this, I think, again, lends credibility, just like you said earlier, that when people show some trauma, that to you adds credibility to their account. I would say the fact that we're seeing our conceptions, our categories being transcended by the reality of what we're finding lends credibility that this is more likely true. This is real. This is either coming from a sophisticated intelligence that has coexisted alongside us, or has come from some other planet or some other dimension, again, using that as a placeholder, or perhaps that even some of these might be future humans who are coming back where technology between external technology and consciousness has collapsed into kind of an integrated fabric now. I've talked about that before. That might be what we're seeing here. But again, to me, it lends credibility to this evidence that we're seeing products. Is that even the right word? We're seeing things, machines. Is that even the right word? We're seeing kind of embodied consciousness seamlessly integrated with technology in such a way that blows apart our understandings, but is exactly what I think we would expect to see if it is something truly sophisticated.
Yeah, 100%. I think if you think about the gap between intelligence here being extremely wide, then how do you bridge the gap? How do you narrow that? And it's a huge challenge, right? One, it assumes that the gap could actually be bridged at all, but if it can be, how do you awaken the human population to the presence of a much higher intelligent species or several species? It's not something you can just plop an object down and be like, well, we're done here. There's a lot more to it than just that technological layer, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing not only with these accounts, but with the accounts that we've heard over the years. Right? We have so many experiencer accounts that talk about the strange elements of contact, and that's part of this conversation. And I know a lot of people don't want to hear that because it's frustrating and it feels very subjective, and you feel like you can't put it into a laboratory. But that's not going away, and we're gonna have to find ways to have those conversations and hold space for that material, because it's certainly part of what this happens to be.
Something else that came out of this series of interviews, actually, that Jake had, is clues about the organization behind all of this, behind the cover-up, behind how the government has been operating these programs, which, again, I would suggest that's exactly what we should expect to see. Rather than there being one day where disclosure finally happens, what we instead see is a flow, an increasing flow over time of secrets from inside, including how the organization actually worked. So what Jake talked about was organizational chaos and secrecy. So he spoke to a fragmented structure. So rather than there being a single tidy chain of command, Jake described a tangle of compartmentalized private and government programs where aerospace contractors often hold key hardware and data. Of course, we've heard that for a while now. And even high-ranking officials can be left in the dark. So I think this was one of the most compelling and revealing aspects of the interview, was the degree to which this is not well organized from within. And he almost seemed to laugh at the notion that some people in the public have about how this must be one well-oiled machine from top to bottom. Not at all the case. And because there's such an emphasis on secrecy and compartmentalization, siloing, as we've referred to it in the past, there's very little information that can leak from one side to the other. And very often the people who are, for instance, congressionally in charge of overseeing these programs never even hear about them. And of course, on top of that, like I discussed before, you have plausible deniability being in the mix as well. even to the point where Jake talked about even now when whistleblowers are going before Congress, often the Congress people will send their staffers. So there's one element of plausible deniability between them and this truth, because if they hear it directly, they're now responsible. And if they're called to speak under oath in front of a congressional committee, they have to legally tell the truth. But if their staffer knows the truth and they only hear the parts they want to hear, then they can plausibly deny without incriminating themselves. So this is what's happening. We're seeing this dance happen where this seems to be unraveling from within. But as it's coming out, we're also seeing Congress people dancing with how do they deal with this in terms of both the consequences for our civilization, but also how they handle this as professional politicians.
Yeah, and I just want to add one quick point to that. He mentions how when he went to, I forget, it was a Senate, he gave his testimony in a skiff, and he said, I kind of need some protection here. And they're like, we actually need you to help protect us because we are equally afraid of the gatekeepers of these programs, and we don't feel comfortable, sticking our necks out too much because we've been threatened or maybe threatened by these particular groups. So yeah, that tells you quite a lot about the role that the secret keepers have in our government and the hold that they have on our officials, and it should make you really question, what we've been able to know, how we're able to know it, when we're able to know it, all of those things. Because most politicians, just like most people, there is leverage, right? Somebody's got a secret they don't want somebody to know about, and so, or they got family that they want to protect, whatever it may be. And I think, you're seeing that on full display here in what he's recounting. So very, very interesting. It's going to be a wild year.
That is the understatement of the century. But I'll also add that one of the things that came up was, again, the way that these psionics would work. Now, there are some challenging aspects to this as well. It's all not sunshine and roses, because there are biological chemical means to basically attune people to the psionic capacity. And this sometimes has involved children. And Jesse kind of pushed him a bit on this about how comfortable he is with this, because Jake asserted that some programs have used controversial methods like stress inoculation and mind-altering protocols, and in some cases exploited children or impoverished populations who have latent psionic gifts. So he is disturbed by the ethical implications. He did admit that, though he says it's not always forced trafficking, because he's heard of people who willingly participate because they're well compensated and because they feel like it legitimizes their unusual abilities. Now, my take here is that I certainly think that's part of the picture. But unfortunately, when we look back at the history of our government, we see many, many times where they have used people inappropriately, where they have used people to their ends, and they don't have much concern at all as to what happens to those people. In fact, even Jake says that his team is often seen as the sacrificial limb, that if things ever get too risky, too hot for the people up top, they will basically just sever the arm of the people who actually have the knowledge. And now there is total plausible deniability because it never happened, and the people who have the knowledge are no longer alive. He's aware that's happened. He's been quite concerned over the last few years that might happen to him. He's been basically going to Congress, like you suggested, to get protection from that, only to find them saying, can you offer us protection? Because you claim to be the boogeyman. You're the guy who knows what you're doing. We're just average politicians who are elected here. That in itself is bizarre and kind of just shows you what a comedy of errors it is to some degree. And again, kind of takes apart this notion people have of the big bad government being one big thing that's really well organized. We're seeing anything but being described here by Jake, which I think kind of vindicates perspectives that you and I have shared before in this podcast about the nature of government and how it works. But let's just spend a minute on this issue of women and children being used in these programs, sometimes being compensated. But I just want to make the point here that I'm aware of situations where people have been recruited in and often abused and misused, and basically they're seen as a means to an end. They may be given money temporarily. They may be given a really nice place to stay, which to them is going to seem like immense riches, but then they're often pumped full of drugs to enhance their capabilities. And the kind of drugs that are used, the kind of protocols they go through, I have heard can also quickly deteriorate the human brain. And these people often die quite young as a result and are kind of just cast aside as pawns. And then the next group comes in. And of course, the really sad and tragic part here, and the outrageous part, is that they're going into the developing world and taking these people so that no one will ever know. No one will ever sort of stand up and say, what happened to my son, my daughter, my niece, my uncle, my aunt? These people just disappear, never to be seen again. And because we in the first world have this capacity, we kind of use it for our own ends, and the results be damned in terms of those people. And so often with our government, we've seen this notion that the ends justify the means. And I kind of got the sense, I'm curious to get your sense as well, but I could tell that Jake was a bit uncomfortable, and maybe even a bit of willful ignorance I felt was being engaged with there, because we've heard from other people that some more nefarious things are going on. And based on the history of our government, I think that's the most likely scenario. What's your take on all that?
No, I think that that's very fair. And I think we'd be naive to think that there wasn't some sort of abuse in a program like this, that we can say all day long that we're offering them compensation and room and board and all these great things and a life away from poverty and horrible conditions. But that just may be the things we say to assuage the guilt that we have for basically enslaving them. And so I think it's a very real possibility. While you were talking, I'm also thinking about the Netflix show Stranger Things, which has Seven is the psi-capable young person in that storyline who was subjected to all the things you just talked about. She was kind of held against her will. She was given drugs. She was traumatized, all to elicit a greater manifestation of her psi ability. And I find that very interesting. Right, that's a part of the kind of public conversation in our consciousness now. And how that might bleed over into aspects of reality certainly is very plausible, in my opinion. And of course, Jake only has a very narrow picture of one particular program. And so, there, as there are lots of programs that are active, and I'm sure these psionic assets all come in a variety of different forms and are used for a variety of different means.
Yes. All right. So we've ventured into the crossover from the nuts and bolts into the woo a lot in this podcast. We've even delved into some of the spiritual aspects. Now, speaking of recent interviews and the engagement of these kind of topics, we know that Diana Pasulko recently was interviewed on the Sean Ryan show. All sorts of interesting things to get into here that very much dovetail from what we've discussed so far in terms of psionics, psychic capacities, spirituality, multidimensionality, all these things. So basically, Diana talked about this sort of metaphysical superstructure, basically, that surrounds and subsumes our reality, and that people can tap into these realms, if you want to call them that, these states of being, through various means, not just through things like psionic activities and perhaps even the beings that we're encountering, the craft we're encountering that we call UAP, that we used to call UFOs, but even through use of psychedelics and things like that, or ancient spiritual rituals, the rituals of certain secret schools in the past, occultic kind of practices. What she's suggesting is that these all access these greater domains, and that it's potentially dangerous to go into those domains. And she certainly seemed to stress the fact that the character of the person, the preparation of the person, plays a big role in that. There's numerous things to break down here, but because Diana was going on to a show of a guy who the host, is a purported evangelical Christian, it's not surprising, I guess, that we veered into more religious territory or spiritual territory. And I saw afterwards, Diana commented that she was really happy that she was able to do that and that people seemed to be engaged with it. And for the first time, she, in being pressed by Sean to give her perspective and not just give the standard religious studies kind of perspective, she admitted she does believe in a soul, an eternal soul. And we do need to be wary of that when we get into these kinds of realms and deal with different kinds of intelligences. She goes out of her way to say, this is not the perspective of my university, and this is not what I teach as a religious studies professor, but this is my internal conviction. And part of her experience with the UFO phenomenon over the last 12 years or so has led to that conviction. So a lot to get into here, but give me your initial take on that interview and the matters they went into.
Yeah, I found it to be one of the best interviews that she's done, and I've had a chance to talk to her a couple of times on Calling All Beings. This was really well done. It provided enough long form time to get into some of these topics in ways that I don't think she's explored publicly before. Particularly because Sean pressed her, and also he seemed personally just fascinated by elements of the Catholic tradition and her understanding of those things, her understanding of the Bible, you know, pushing her into kind of addressing her personal opinion on that, and also her academic opinion on those subjects. I think was really really useful. It it there's a whole lot to say, I think, about that conversation. One of the things that I'll start off with noting is she talks about, sort of, we talk about realms and sort of cognitive sovereignty, I think is the phrase that she uses. There's a famous levitating saint, Saint Teresa of Avila. She's known to be, going through these moments of levitation. And if you want to read more about that, there's a great book called They Flew by Carlos Ayer that I'm currently reading. It gets into that account. But one fascinating thing about Teresa's experiences, is one, she's recounting those experiences autobiographically, but also she has the sort of uh, those who are interrogating her experience at the same time, because the Catholic Church, wanted to promote authentic experience and not, just kind of pick up anybody's fantastic story and then all of a sudden they just become a saint. They really kind of, drilled people and asked their colleagues, and is this stuff actually happening or is it not happening? But one of the fascinating things about Teresa's experience is she didn't want them to happen. She was levitating and she actually didn't want that to happen. So this notion of our cognitive sovereignty, or us being able to, will something to not occur just because we don't want it to occur, because we don't want to engage with it, I think is challenged a little bit from this one account, and certainly from other accounts that we know of in the experiencer literature. Most of the experiencers that I know that had a very traumatic experience, they had a lot of will to not encounter this and to not engage with it, but they didn't have a choice. And so you can see them very publicly wrestle with that component of how the line between free will, and that intersection between non-human intelligence is very blurred and quite confusing. And so I think that that's something worth exploring there. I certainly appreciate her perspective that, she doesn't want to willingly experience a download or navigate into those other realms. But I kind of question the degree to which we have a tremendous degree of control over exactly how those experiences play out, or at least we kind of fool ourselves into thinking how much control we may actually have. So that's just one aspect of the conversation I found really interesting. There's a whole host of other ones to get into. But what's your take on that, or what else jumped out for you initially in that conversation?
Well, what comes to mind when I hear what you just said there is that that's well put. And I would say that again, the question is, do we make a mistake by assuming this is all kind of one thing? We put it into one bucket. And may it be the case that we do have some degree of cognitive, and I would say spiritual or energetic sovereignty, but in some situations, in a certain refraction of our being, it might appear that we don't. I think that comes in here as well. The segment that I'm going to speak as part of this panel at Archives of the Impossible is on the ethics of contact, and that's one of the things we'll get into. And one of the issues we've wrestled with in the John Mack Institute is this notion of the multidimensional self and even multidimensional ethics. And this is right at the heart of our conversation today, because we're talking about the spiritual, energetic, the woo, right, overlay here. And part of that not only reframes how we think about them, but it reframes how we think about ourselves. And in the same way that they're perhaps trying to encourage and inspire us to step into greater capacities we have in terms of psionics, they also, again, the more benevolent ones, frequently try to remind us about who we truly are and our true capacities. And that involves things like a higher self, that we exist on this kind of hierarchy of fractals. And that, of course, changes how we think about agency, how we think about things like human rights, I sometimes hear people kind of understandably debate whether or not this is basically felonies that are being committed here. I know that Luel Elizondo has said this, kidnapping, assault, things like that. But many of the experiencers, while it's true what you said, that some people have had negative experiences that would not want to have them again if they had the choice, there are other people who begin not liking it so much, but then come into this awareness that they did have a part to play, and they remember at a different level of themselves, if you will, agreeing to this, and actually this being part of a larger plan, which again points to the fact that not only are they different than we sometimes conceive, but reality itself, this integrated, interpenetrating series of mindscapes, if that's what reality is, then that completely throws disclosure on its head. And this is why I've so often said the part about disclosure that seems problematic to me is, where do you know where to stop? How can you just let it out a little bit? It's kind of like being a little bit pregnant. How do you do that exactly? Because the implications for the nature of reality, the nature of ourselves, who we truly are, life and death, all of that is wrapped up in this. So that's what I think about with that. That's going to be a very interesting conversation that we're just barely beginning to crack the surface of at this point. But something else that Diana talked about was Plato's Republic and Plato's Cave. This is something that comes up a lot in her interviews. She really likes this kind of metaphor. And it was also very interesting to see her get into this, because you saw her being very impassioned about this, because it wasn't just some notion from the past or some, loose approximation. She seemed very convicted around the notion that we are being controlled, that we are being subject to a control structure, which very much dovetails with my most recent POC episode, where I talked about that as well. So she's basically saying, we are seeing the shadows on the cave, and we are assuming that's reality, but it's not. And she also made the point that that's being done purposefully, which of course then led Sean to ask the question, okay, Diana, then who are the puppet masters? So what did you think about that, and how would you answer that question?
Well, I mean, I was cheering him on because I asked her the exact same question when she came on to our show. So I really wanted her to address who those puppet masters were, and at our time getting her to answer that. I was very interested in her faith story. I didn't know that. I knew that she had grown up in a secular house, but I didn't know the degree to which she had such a strong conviction turning to her faith at a young age. I mean, she had essentially kind of a calling, a very strong calling to pursue this path, this academic path, and she has devoted her life to that. And I find that really interesting, and it feels like she has protected her faith very, very strongly. And so when you get into questions about, who's the puppet master, who's the deceiver, essentially, think of it from that perspective. I think that might be useful. Who's the deceiver deceiving those of us who are in the cave into thinking that we are seeing reality when we are not? Well, from the lens of a Christian perspective, there's really only, one deceiver, right? Then the deceiver would be, Satan, the adversary of God, right? And of course, then you bring in the notions of demons and other entities that are against the forces of good, of course, against the forces of God and angels, etc. And the conversation absolutely veers into that territory. Like you said, we can't seem to shake the angels and demons component in the UFO conversation. And for you and I, we spent a great bit of time discussing that. It is frustrating because I think it's too narrow of a frame to consider all of this. As you talked about in your response to my comments, I'm thinking about the fact that the dissociative boundaries between our conscious sort of expression, what we know as you and I, and the non-human intelligence conscious expression, the boundaries between those things aren't as sort of impermeable as we like to think. There's a great deal of bleed over. If all of this is in fact all of us, then anything that we actively shun, I don't want to have an experience, I don't want to download, I don't want to know this or that, that only grows the shadow aspect of ourselves and kind of opens us and exposes us to the components of reality that are still very much there that we must incorporate into who we are, because it ultimately is part of us. And so by just pretending that it's not there doesn't in fact make it go away. So yeah, it's a long answer to your question, but I think it was very revealing about her personal beliefs, and this puppet master question in particular, I think veers often into some territory that I get where we're going there, but I also am a little bit frustrated that it tends to be narrowly defined by kind of the forces of good and evil.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's probably a good place for us to sort of close out this episode around, because, yeah, at one point, Sean sort of states it plainly, right? He says that when I look at it, it kind of looks like this is all about angels and demons. And he literally means it's all about angels and demons, meaning every movement, every machination in society now and across time has really been about the battle between these two opposing forces, these very binary forces, good versus evil, light versus dark. And he even calls it demonic. Now, to Diana's credit, I would say, she says, well, that's your term. I would maybe use a different term. But she is suggesting that, and I think this is what she really wanted to highlight, was that there's more than meets the eye going on, basically. And we need to look to these deeper metaphysical matters to understand what's happening here. And that I would say part of us as human beings sort of advancing into, growing into, expanding into this more transcendent view of ourselves actually gets us in touch with those metaphysical matters, and then we can access more of our agency. Part of the legacy, unfortunately, of physicalism is it makes us believe none of that's even real. So not only do we not access our agency, but we're easily duped and manipulated because we're not even accounting for it, we're not even checking for it. So I think that's really important here. But to your point, absolutely agreed. And I made this point on social media yesterday, that the binary framing, though, is the problem. And this is what I said in regard to that particular matter. I said, quote, acknowledging there is a spiritual component to UAP is essential, but spiritual, quote unquote, doesn't equal flat good versus evil. That's why reducing the landscape to angels and demons, quote unquote, isn't helpful even as a placeholder, because that misrepresents the spectrum-like nature of consciousness, unquote. So that's what I would say if I was in that conversation, because I do think we need to be aware of these matters. We do need to be aware of the multidimensional self and the fact that we are subsumed by this larger reality. But reducing it to binaries, actually think in the long term does more harm than good.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. That's really well put. I hope we get to explore that further. I think that's a really important component of this conversation. This notion of spirituality itself is also really important. In some ways, I think we've done ourselves a disservice by even introducing that term, because it creates this bifurcation of, things that are quote unquote spiritual and things that are quote unquote scientific. We tend to have these demarcations that I honestly don't think are actually very useful, because it is all one thing. And so that is in part where these notions really harm the conversation, and we've got to do a lot of work to, I think, retcon the human experience away from that split. So the work lies ahead for all of us who are trying to do that. So yeah, really solid conversation. I know we covered a lot of ground on this episode. I'm sure that'll be the end of cool things happening in UFOs for the next few weeks. We'll just have to catch up next time and talk about our favorite, sort of recipes over the first quarter of the year. But no, I think it's going to be very interesting. I think that what Barber has done will embolden other whistleblowers, that these conversations are happening in more and more public spaces, more and more high-profile podcasts. And I think those of us who've been championing this for a while may feel a little frustration in that, but also we should be celebrating it, that these conversations are spilling out into the mainstream and provide opportunities for us to engage with our family and friends in these very important topics. So on that note, thank you all for listening and joining us on this show. And may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Phrames.